we've had you on to discuss these events previously, but what led you to set up this one in particular to speak about The Big Chill?
Well, I have to say, first off, that I'm a huge fan of Carol Littleton. In fact, she was the first person I honored for an event a couple years ago, for UCLA Film and Television Archive. So I just am always eager to do anything with her, to be honest. But I'm also a big fan of The Big Chill. I think it's timeless, and I think there's a lot to be said about it. And then when I found out that her husband and the cinematographer of The Big Chill was also going to be coming, I was doubly thrilled. I think it's a very unique situation to be able to talk to both the cinematographer and the editor. I've never done that before. And their sensibilities are so inspiring and fascinating that I'm really excited. We're going to run the whole film, which also makes the experience much fuller,
Yeah. So Ms. Littleton, when you think back on The Big Chill, what were the challenges that were specific to that project for you, the biggest challenges?
Well, in a sense, they're the biggest challenges on any film, since everyone's always different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this one in particular, the difficulty really was in trying to make it seem as imperceptible as possible, changing and linking from one story or one episode to the next, having a sense of flow from one character to the next. There's a lot of, it's an ensemble piece, and on one hand, that's difficult to support sometimes. And on the other hand, I think the humor was particularly interesting because it's humor that comes out of character as opposed to situations, and many times that's very difficult to do as well. And I think the third difficulty, I'm giving you a long-winded answer.
No, thank you for it.
The tone shifts from, if you want to call it episode to episode, when a scene is centered around one character and then the focus shifts to another character, keeping all of those gears and changes in tempo and in feeling alive is challenging.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was considering that when I was thinking about The Big Chill and your work on it, because obviously as an ensemble piece, you have to make sure that each character kind of gets their moment and it comes across as clearly defined. And I'm sure that a lot of that is first cemented in the screenplay. But
absolutely.
But for you in the editing room with the footage you had, that was a big consideration. Were there lots of instances of taking out and tweaking and to get those moments right?
It's been quite a while since I've even thought about The Big Chill, but yes, you're absolutely right. It was difficult. Every actor comes with their own particular strengths and I guess we could say also weaknesses, or perhaps weaknesses isn't the best way to describe it, but they certainly have ways of dealing with situations that are different from one another, and they have their strengths. So it was always a question of being able to bring out the best balance in the performances, not just an isolated performance, but how it connected to the other characters. Well, it's tricky in ensemble work. It's very tricky.
Yeah. And you've worked with Mr. Kasdan many times, but this was one of your earliest collaborations with him.
The second one,
Yeah, after Body Heat, which is an amazing movie. But what kind of coverage do you get from him? What's unique about his coverage?
I think he so carefully writes his scripts that he goes in with a preconception of how he wants the scenes to be played. Now, that said, he's pretty loose on the set. He lets things, he's not tied to a certain shooting order or size or a particular mise en scène. He's very loose with that, but he comes with a very strong idea of what he feels the emotional values need to be in a scene. So depending upon the performances, we would either have a lot of coverage or we would have maybe one shot. Just, it would depend upon the day, the difficulties of the day, the scheduling of the day. But for the most part, I would say that the film was very, from scene to scene, was very well covered.
Yeah, and the music, obviously, plays a huge role.
Huge part.
Yeah, and obviously, some of those songs are clearly necessary. You knew that you'd need them because the scene is built around them, but
playback or whatever.
Right, but was he very specific about this is absolutely the song I want for this particular scene, or was there experimentation?
No, it was actually very loose. It was pretty experimental. There were 2 songs that were written into the script. Precisely. The first one was Heard It From the Grapevine, the Marvin Gaye song, and then the other one was Too Proud to Beg, where it's actually choreographed. It's when they're doing the dishes. It was choreographed to that, and it was done with playback because they were kind of singing along. The rest of it, it's interesting because you think now this is done so much, using hit songs in lieu of score, but this was one of the first times that it was done. It was unusual at the time. And I know that Larry got a contract with Motown to use their library, so we had a lot of music that was accessible to us contractually before we started. And Larry and Meg, his wife, Meg Kasdan, were in college. This is a little bit inspired by their life at Michigan University. There were lots of things that were popular when they were there, and they wanted to be able to use songs that were popular within a 3-year period leading up to 1969. So that narrowed it down somewhat. But I worked with transfers of some 150 songs that we just tried until we found things that would work. This was back in the time of film, I had 2 full racks of 35 millimeter film, songs transferred onto film so that we could just use them very quickly.
What really impresses me about them, and I see this in a lot of films, I mean, Scorsese uses popular music very inventively in his work too. But some films, I see that some of the music that they use is a little too on the nose. But with a movie like Big Chill, it isn't on the nose. It just feels right.
Once we found the tone of a song that would work, and I tried lots of things and would audition things with Larry or by myself and would kind of make preliminary choices about things. And once we decided on a song, I would recut the scene to fit the song because we hadn't, we couldn't. You can't change a pop song. You can't cut it. People know it too well. So I think perhaps that might be one reason why the feeling that it fits is because I cut it to the song.
That could have something to do with it. Yeah. So Bobby, when you look at this movie, what are the characteristics of it that you're struck by?
Well, I think that when you're talking about music, I think music is actually a character in the film. I think it represents a nostalgia or a yearning for another time. These are people that went to college together, who bonded, and then meet up again 15 years later. And I also do think that the way Carol used music was incredibly. There's a lot of very subtle things that you might not be aware of, and it could be contrapuntal to the scene. It could support the scene. It could be score. It could be source. Music within a scene would sometimes transform itself in many different ways. Carol and I talked this morning about a movie like La Ronde, which is an inspiration for this movie, where it's almost theatrical. There's sort of this seamless way that a curtain closes and opens and closes again from scene to scene. The transitions are very challenging because, it will start with an emphasis on one character, which will lead to another, which will lead to another scene, and it's not propulsed by plot or by action, but by character and by tone and by dialogue, which reveals character. So it seems very fluid, the movie, but I think it's very challenging to achieve that as an editor.
But in terms of your work with Mr. Kasdan, obviously you guys have done many films together.
Yes.
How do you work with him that is unique to that particular collaboration?
our taste is very similar, and having worked now on, my goodness, I think it's 10 films now, might even be 11, I feel I know pretty much what he likes, and he's able to tell me in just a few words, a few sentences, look, I think the emphasis ought to be here, or why don't you try that, or I hadn't really thought of that, that's kind of cool, so why don't you follow through on your thinking. It's just very loose. We really have a dialogue about the editing process. Right. And I would have to say that he has a great deal of faith in editing, which a lot of younger, I would say, other directors many times don't. They get very impatient. Certainly, producers do get impatient with the editing process and don't realize that you're actually working through a lot of different problems and different ways of looking at a scene, and you just need to give it time and be able to explore a lot of different ways of doing things. Mm-hmm. And Larry's just very loose with that.
I've read a quote from you where you've talked about that you can only pre-think it so much. I mean, you have to just go in and start cutting. So how much of that process for you is kind of intellectual and how much of it is intuitive?
Well, I think the intellectual part, when I get a script, especially with one of Larry's scripts that is so beautifully written, I make notes not so much about comments that I want to talk to Larry about, but feelings and moments that are very strong for me as I'm just sort of click the margin, make a little X or something in the margin of the script as I go through, because I find that my first impression when I'm reading one of Larry's scripts especially is the one that I want to keep when I'm cutting it. Mm-hmm. I want to be able to keep that freshness. I want to be able to keep that first reaction to a scene or to a character or to a moment in the plot. So I let that be my guide for a more intuitive approach when I'm cutting. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
That absolutely does, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. So were there test screenings for this film, and if there were those helpful?
On this one, we showed it to the studio, and they said, if this is supposed to be a comedy, we're not laughing, go back and work it over again. And Larry was just absolutely, well, if you can understand, he said, God, what are we going to do? They don't get the humor. This is crazy. So we decided that we would preview it. We went back and we made some changes, some things that were talked about and we thought we ought to do. We made those changes, and then we did preview the film in Seattle to a young audience, a college-age audience for the most part. And the same people who felt that this was not a comedy went to the screening, and people laughed all the way through it, either with it or at it. And then at that particular point, it was very clear because the audience reacted to it as if it were a comedy, but also a serious film, which is precisely what we wanted.
Right.
The humor is interwoven into some very serious issues and very serious ideas and moments in the film.
Right,
so
and very seamlessly.
We glided through the changes in tone pretty well. Then we did have 2 screenings. There was a question about the ending, which I'm sure everybody talks about as a flashback, which was a long extended scene. It was about 10 minutes long of the whole cast of characters in Michigan when they were students in 1969.
Right.
We previewed one night with it and one night without the flashback, which occurs at the end of the film. And it was very, 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 very clear that the screening without the flashback was precisely the way we needed to go.
So the flashback included Costner?
Yes.
Is that? Yes. And so what about that flashback felt wrong to the rhythm of the film?
Well, the flashback in and of itself was a wonderful, wonderful extended sequence. Mm-hmm. No problem with that if you could look at it in an isolated way. It just simply made the film experience too specific for the audience. They said, this is an experience for those people at that time. The minute that we dropped the flashback, it became a universal experience of growing up and having the seeds of who you are at that age in college somehow come to fruition 15 years later in the film of The Big Chill.
Right.
So it was so clear. I can't tell you, and sometimes these things are. You say, well, what was I thinking of? Then Larry and I talked about this a lot, even before we had previews, because we knew that it was not working as well as it should, the flashback. So
right.
we tried it in all different places. We tried it where it was scripted at the end. We tried it opening the film up and dropping it in as cross-cutting. We did all kinds of things to try to retain the flashback. But the fact of the matter is that was the idea that Larry needed to write the script. But once he had written it, it had so informed, this whole flashback had so informed the whole script that you simply did not need it.
Isn't it fascinating how, I mean, it's kind of editing, it's such an elusive kind of thing, but after a while, the film itself tells you what it needs. Exactly.
The film just tells you. And this is a perfect example of that.
Mm. I just wanted to say it is interesting, too, that not only did it make it more timeless by not having the ending, but the realization, Carol, isn't it true that, that you achieved everything you wanted in terms of what you wanted to say about the characters and how, everything was crystallized in terms of what they were and what they had become, and you already knew what they were without having to see it.
We didn't have to have an example. We didn't have to have the dramatization of how they were in 1969 to have a full appreciation of who the characters were.
Something else that interests me, anytime I speak with actors in particular who have a problem looking at their own work because they only see the flaws, is it the same at all for you? I mean, if you see a film that you worked on years ago, are you stuck in that zone where you're thinking, if only I had that shot, or are you still stuck in that place?
Me, I hate to say this, but it's sort of the opposite. I look at it and say, God, did I actually think of that? That was pretty clever.
Well, remember, beautiful. I mean, when we did the first event, we were actually, it was all about body heat. We screened the whole film. And this was for an audience. This is many years later, and a lot of people in the audience hadn't seen the movie. And Carol was watching it with this whole new generation, and she was saying, "This is really good.
Yeah,
good movie.
It really holds up. I mean, I think good work always holds up." And
a lot of times the flaws, you spend so much time dealing with a problem. You spend most of your time dealing with a problem. You really can't appreciate. A problem becomes the Grand Canyon, but it's really on a tiny little rivulet in the film. And when you look at it, you're just far more forgiving than when you're working on it.
Right. I actually wanted to ask you about one other film that you've worked on before I let you go, because it's in my top 5 favorite films ever.
Oh,
that is The Accidental Tourist. It's so beautiful, but for me it seems that's one of those films that the tone of that is so delicate. Was that a major challenge to maintain that tone?
Very delicate. You're absolutely right. It was very, very delicate, because you could fall into pathos or bathos, so easily. And yet we really had to ride the razor's edge to not fall into any sort of sentimentality. And to feel the strain of the marriage between Kathleen Turner and William Hurt, as well as this strange woman who really knew what the character of William Hurt needed. I'm talking about Muriel in the film. It was a very, very delicate thing to do, and along with keeping all of the emotions taut, we also had the elements of humor that needed to be interwoven. So it was an exercise in it was a tonal exercise, completely.
Yeah, I mean, from beginning to end, and just the beautiful oddity of these characters, but not so odd that they feel like cartoons or caricatures. I mean, they feel like real people. It just immerses you in this world. That I've always adored that movie. So thank you very much for that movie, for me personally.
You're very, very welcome.
I love that you mentioned that movie.
We used Ann Tyler's novel as our Bible, because the tone and the sense of the characters these odd characters in this sort of humdrum, world of Baltimore. We really referred to that all the time to make sure that we were being true to her work.
Yeah. And I'm always amazed and marveled by William Hurt's performance in that film. His emotions kind of seem, and it's in keeping perfectly with the character, but they kind of seem so dislocated from him. Mm-hmm. I mean, his reactions are a little odd, but does he give you, as a performer, does he experiment a lot? I mean, do you have a lot of choices from him?
A lot of choices within a range that you would measure in calipers. It's not as though it's a range. In that particular case, he's such a gifted actor.
Yeah.
He had a range of, let's say, 1 to 10. Another actor might have given you a range of 1 to 100. His performance you could actually you could measure in calipers. And the key to his performance, at least for Larry and I when we were working on it in the cutting room, is the sense of grief that is so great that you feel disembodied.
Yes.
You can't grasp the world around you. It's all altered. In fact, there's a line in the film where he says, "I just don't feel like, I am living in this world," essentially. Mm. So that's what we were trying to capture, was the notion of grief being so profound.
But it brings up one more last question. I'm so sorry, but because the score for The Accidental Tourist, I adore as well. So when you're dealing with, do you deal with score the same way you would pop music in The Big Chill in terms of placement or cutting the scene to the score? Is that pretty much already predetermined?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. John Williams, of course, did the score for Accidental Tourist, and he. In the novel, it says that Macon Leary listens to concert music. So I had used concert music to score it as our temp score all the way through, using Bach two-part inventions and, all kinds of things that are mentioned in the novel, as a matter of fact. So I used a lot of those things and used... I was trying to remember what I did use for that scene that I just described. Oh, yeah, it was a tune on G string, the Bach. I'm just trying to think. Yes, I think that was right. And so I asked John Williams if he wanted my temp score, and he says, no, just give it to me without, because I want to, I don't want to be influenced by your score, because I had cut everything to the classical music. And then, after he had worked on it for a while, he said, I really feel I would like to see your temp. Mm. So I showed it to him, and he said, God, the rhythm of these scenes is so, the tempo is so close to what I envisioned. Mm. So that's really a good temp, so I felt very...
By the way, Jamie, I don't know if you know this, but Carol is a classically trained musician.
Wow. Well, that would definitely come in handy in the editing room, I would imagine.
In handy. Yeah.
And what did you say, Carol? You didn't want to spend your life in dark little rehearsal rooms, and look where she ended up.
In the cutting room.
But I do think Carol's sensibility as a musician is particularly acutely played out in the editing room, and there is always a musicality to editing, but particularly with Carol. I think her sensibility is pretty amazing, and even how she expresses herself when she talks about her work. Sorry to talk about you in the third person, Carol.
Not behind my back, but on the phone.
But I really do think it's very significant. And Carol, I interviewed Carol for my second book as well, and I think her vocabulary is very, very much informed by her history as a musician and her passion as a musician,
So tell me about the event, Bobby. When it takes place, where, what time, everything for our listeners.
Okay, it's at the Bright Family Screening Room, which is part of Emerson's Paramount Center in Boston. Mm-hmm. And I just did an event there recently. It's a beautiful space.
Mm-hmm.
And what's also exciting is a lot of Emerson students come, and college students. There's so many college students in Boston, and in fact, Carol and John are going to be teaching classes at Emerson before our event.
Wow.
But it's from 7 to 10, and we're going to be showing the entire film as well as running the first 10 minutes beforehand and deconstructing that particular opening sequence. There's so much to say about it. The credit sequence in the very beginning before the funeral starts. And then
when you introduce all of the characters, yeah.
Exactly. And it's so highly choreographed and so brilliantly conceived, both in terms of cinematography and editing and, of course, directing and writing. And then, of course, there's going to be opportunity for the audience to ask questions of Carol and John. So we have a full 3.5 hours set aside to just really celebrate not only the film, but these two extraordinary talents who happen to be married to each other.
Yeah.